Welcome, everybody. This is the BBB Forum on Corporate Responsibility. And now to present is Claire Rosenzweig. She is the president and the CEO of the Metro New York BBB and its foundation. Claire?
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the 2020 BBB Forum on Corporate Responsibility. This is our 13th one and our first ever online edition of this annual program. The Better Business Bureau promotes integrity in business practices, and that is why we provide this forum. It's a way of sharing ideas on what business responsibility looks like now. Now, this year has been a difficult one for all of us. However, at this pivotal moment, we have an opportunity to rethink how we work. We have the opportunity to look at ways in which we can be more resilient now and to open doors to a stronger future. Today, because trust has been disrupted in just so many ways, the job of building trust is vital. And so the topics covered by our distinguished speakers today are all related to trust, diversity and inclusion, next steps in corporate responsibility, and workplace health and safety. But first, some important thank yous to start with. First, our deep thanks to Ernst & Young, the major sponsor of today's program. We also thank Nielsen, the leadership sponsor of today's program, and many thanks to our event supporters. There were 13 of them, plus BBBs in your communities. We have so many of you online today. They helped us create awareness of this event, and as you can see, they're right up there on the screen. Now, a few notes about today's webinar. We welcome questions. You'll see on the screen there's a question box, and we certainly invite you to type in your questions about the subjects that are being covered. We'll answer as many of them as we can in the limited time that we have. You're also welcome to tweet away at the BBB Forum. That's hashtag BBB Forum. You can see that at the bottom of the screen as well. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of our Metro New York BBB, Eric Solomon, Senior Vice President of Client Solutions, Nielsen. He is going to introduce our keynote speaker, and he will also moderate the Q&A session with our keynote speaker. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks so much, Claire. It's great to be here. Thanks to all of you who are attending for coming out for this first ever webcast forum. It's my privilege to be here both as the chair of the New York Metro BBB, but also as an associate of our keynote speaker. So let me tell you all about Sandra Sims-Williams, who will be speaking, and then, as Claire said, we will take some questions. Sandra is Senior Vice President of Diversity Inclusion at Nielsen. She was appointed to that role at the beginning of this year, January 2020, and leads our Nielsen's D&I strategy and team. Sandra's a transformational leader with 30 years of experience in linking diversity and inclusion strategies with corporate initiatives. Prior to joining Nielsen, she was Publicis Group's Chief Diversity Officer and has deep background in diverse leadership development, retention programming, analytics and effectiveness, supplier diversity, multicultural talent acquisition, and corporate initiatives that drive diversity and inclusion cross-functionally. In 2019, she made the Black Enterprise Top Corporate Executives list, the inaugural Champion, Adweek and AdColor, and Savoy Magazine's Most Influential Women in Corporate America list. Sandra is also a member of the Advertising Industry's Diversity Steering Committee and serves on the boards of New York Women in Communication, the Advertising Club of New York, and ColorCom. Sandra also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and a Master of Arts degree from Hunter College in New York. So without further ado, Sandra, please take over, and we will take your questions. As Claire said, put them into the question box on the right, and we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Greetings to all, and I pray that you and yours are well. Thanks to Eric Solomon, my colleague at Nielsen, for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. As the new lead at Nielsen, it has been a challenging 7 months for sure. I started in January, and 7 weeks in, we were working from home. Now, just hold that thought for a second. A new job, coming into a B&B organization, not knowing all the leaders or the business units for that matter. Now, technically speaking, and I know generationally there are those out there who know what I'm talking about, I'm now using a new platform. I went from Microsoft to Google. Come on, it was a lot. So this is and was a lot to implement from home. But I've done it, okay? Then my friend and colleague that joined me at Nielsen, unfortunately lost his mother 3 weeks into the lockdown of COVID. Reality sets in, and so does fear. Here's our world today. Slide, please. Yeah, thank you. We have COVID-19 pandemic, we have racial unrest, we have economic uncertainty, lockdowns, and fear. What do you do to keep your mind, spirit, and energy moving forward? You focus on the next day and you plan based on what you can control. You think of how you started and what is necessary to keep your business or organization moving forward. People first. All people, your employees, your customers, your vendors. It is at this point you personally need to take inventory. You are thinking about what you had, how your business and organization was thriving, and the reality of our world is called into question once again by George Floyd's death for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Injustice, hate, and racism become starkly real. One of the things that Eric told me as we were preparing for today is that the Better Business Bureau uses D, E, and I, not just D and I. And that's a good thing. The E is exactly where we need to go so that we can make lasting change. We're talking about people here. People aren't all at the same starting point. So instead of focusing on driving equality, focus on driving equity. Slide 2, please. Change the mindset. Equality versus equity. Changing this mindset means that this is the moment to course correct. You now must ask yourself, what did I miss? Why wasn't I more attuned to others and their plight? Did I not understand the connectivity of their humanity to my business or my organization? What did I miss? Fear sets in again. You are business leaders, organization leaders. You didn't succeed based on fear. And even if you did, it was probably good, righteous fear. You pushed yourself to make decisions that have been fairly successful for your businesses or organization. Now you must make different decisions that are fair and equitable for your future. The organizations that come out of this pandemic of COVID and social injustice will thrive again. It's recognizing your need to change course. That is what is critical. I will address ways you can do just that. Changing course means you are willing to look first inward and develop a plan that puts you in a place where you never have been before and may not have felt it was necessary for your business success. Facing and fighting racism is a necessary part of moving forward. Right now, in this moment, it is an absolute business imperative. First, what are the demographics of your organization? What are the demographics of the people you serve? How do you identify your customer? Is there a way in which you can pivot to engage a new customer base? How do you prepare your present employees for this change? And lastly, what are the most pressing challenges you face in order to make this work for your business and for your people? Because there are so many different types of business owners, profit and not-for-profit, I will keep it basic when addressing these questions. When looking at your demographics, have you hired with diversity in mind? Did you hire who you liked or they fit into your profile? Did it not occur to you that you are serving or could serve a diverse customer base? If you are not serving a diverse customer base, you've missed revenue potential. And you know, and I know that every dollar counts. Why would you do that? Not consider it. Please do. Hire a diverse staff that represents the market. Where do you source for your business? Change your methodology. Blind copy resumes to reduce unconscious bias because we all have it. Ask yourself basic questions about your leadership. When developing your business plan or your organizational strategy, you didn't say, I will only serve this group. Surely that was not your plan. People are your revenue stream on both sides, your employees and your customers. They are both watching you and reflecting on your decisions. Do I want to work for this organization is what they ask. Do I want to buy from or desire service from this organization? Do I support this organization based on what I see and hear about them? Social media can be a truth teller and a negative marketing impact for your business. If you are on the wrong side, it is not going to serve you well. How do you now identify with other or different potential customers? Change your name, place Black Lives Matter signs in your window, on your website, donate to a Black organization, offer to mentor possible new hires or interns, establish a fund for educational advancement of diverse students, meet with Black leaders in your community, hold events signaling your support of an equal and just society, diversify your board of directors and your leadership, use diverse marketing tools, diverse suppliers and vendors. And yes, I could go on, but let me just follow this. Here is how we're putting it together at Nielsen. We're starting this journey too. We are doing some things well, and we have to get better. Slide, please. Embed diversity, equity, and inclusion as catalysts across the organization. I am focusing on people, thought leadership, and inclusive products, supplier diversity, and community outreach. Once you have your own house in order, it's time to look outward. Connect with customers where they are, through the organizations that matter to them. If you're a larger company, make sure you have a supplier diversity strategy and set your targets. Local businesses can work together with your local chambers. Advocate as a group for grants and tax breaks. Look for opportunities to sponsor local schools and community initiatives. And be bold. Visit your police department. Ask about training and development. Support local changes in policing. And of course, let us all vote. If there's one thing you remember from today, it's this: people first. You get that right, all the rest will follow. The next slide illustrates how we're thinking about this at Nielsen. People and process. Start with your leaders and empower. Once you start with your leaders, and that empowers everyone, because we follow leaders' directions. I'm very excited to launch our new course, From Witness to Advocate. This is a 20 to 30-minute session that will help associates identify racism, including more subtle acts or microaggressions, and how you can act as an ally. By moving from a witness to an advocate, you create a cultural shift and contribute to a more inclusive culture. The other focus area for us is creating a safe space for dialogue and conversation. At work, we need to make room for people to share stories of injustice, microaggressions, and inequity, and for others to listen and act to change wherever and however they can. Walk in someone else's shoes. We are connected. We are humanity. Let's be connected. Thank you. And now back to Eric. Eric, you're on mute. I
I'm
can't hear
sorry.
you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
I clicked on mute and I started talking, and it didn't unmute. So thank you. You gave us a lot to think about, and a lot of actual action steps that we are taking here at Nielsen. I shouldn't say here at Nielsen, to move the ball forward here. And I think if there's one thing that I'd like people to take away from the conversation is action. Now is the time for action on all of these things. And I'll come back to that in a second, but I actually wanted to start out with a quick question, if I may be so bold, to talk just a little bit about how the most recent issues that we've been struggling with as a society have impacted you personally. What, given everything that you've been through in your life and what we're going through right now since the death of George Floyd, what, if anything, feels different to you this time around, personally? What are you observing? What are you seeing? What are you feeling?
Well, of course, I actually lived through the civil rights era. This right now is different, though, Eric. It is different in that there are a lot more white colleagues, friends, and others who have joined in the voice of injustice. And I say that because I have never had white friends or colleagues that call just to see how I am. And that to me is a real pivotal point, because it means that we're waking up. And it means that we have to wake up together so that we can clean this thing up. We have to clean this up. This isn't about just Black people, it's about all of us. Who wants to get up hating people? I know that I don't. And that's not what this is about. I mean, I just think that we need to understand the differences among us and better appreciate the life that I lead versus the life that you lead. And when we have those conversations, that's when it starts to happen. So that is different, that we're having the conversations. And I'd say, thank God.
I agree. It's, as a white ally, it's hard to believe we're having this conversation to an extent. And one of the things that I've learned, I've learned a number of things actually just in the past few months. I've learned how much I don't know. And a big part of that is how much I did not know about what the actual Black experience in this country actually can be and has been for so many people. And, it's unfortunate that we've had to go through this to unearth that. And to some extent, I think it's unfortunate that we've had to unearth it at all, because it's painful for people to have to deal with. But if it is a step in the right direction to where we can get where we need to go, I hope that it's meaningful. So speaking of being meaningful and taking action, I know you spent time talking about how you've thought about this, and from the perspective of Nielsen, what we've chosen to do in terms of execution on a strategy. There are a lot of different types of companies out there who are attending today. So wondering, given the bias toward action, how would you think about, a little bit more generally, what would be those first action steps that you would suggest people take in their own businesses?
As I had said in the statement I was making, the leadership is the key. And if the leadership is not on board, has not really thought about how this can affect their business or their organization, then it's sort of a non-starter. There's no reason to even try to wallpaper Don't wallpaper. Because what I do know is that the millennials are pivoting and they are watching us. And some are kind of disgusted by us because they say we are fakes. So I think it's the leadership that has to stand up, speak up, and embrace change. I know that sometimes, you know, we look and see that there's so many older people at the top and that they don't seem to want to change. Well, if you want your business to continue and to show up, you need to change. And if there's anybody to tell us, it's the younger people, because you know what? It's their time. It is their time. So leaders, stand up, make that pivot, and embrace what is now real for that generation.
That's great advice. Just to color that in a little bit more, at Nielsen, our CEO, David Kenny, who you knew from your previous life, and it's one of the reasons he came over. What he did is he became CEO about 1.5 years ago, and he named himself the Chief Diversity Officer. We had already had one, but he said, no, I believe that for meaningful change to happen, the CEO has to be accountable for the diversity program as well, and became our Chief Diversity Officer, and still is 1.5 years later our Chief Diversity Officer. Does that make sense to you? Clearly it does, but is that one of those steps that perhaps other companies may think to take, to put those two hats on one person?
So the first thing, yes, I've known David. So when he did it, I called him because I was still at Publicis Group, obviously. And I said, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? That's a little crazy. Why are you doing it? And he explained. He said, I have the power to challenge the leadership and the rest of the organization to step up and to be accountable for the kind of change that we need as the work that we do. We're all in the weeds of diversity, so we need to be on point. And so for him, it really was about being real, about the people, but also at the end of the day, this is about business. And I would say that, I said that when diversity, it is about the business. But listen, let's all go along because we all want revenue at the end of the day. And if we can have more diverse perspectives in the room, it does, you know, studies have shown that diverse and inclusive leadership teams and workforce actually increase your revenue by as much as 30%. So why wouldn't you do it? I don't understand. It needs to be done. So I applaud him, but I do want my CDO title back, okay?
I think that's fair. Perhaps overdue. Sort of following on that point too, something that I think I would be thinking about if I were in the audience. Those folks don't know David Kenny. David is a white man. I am as well, as you can actually see. And I think a lot of us who are in those privileges, positions of privilege. So David was CEO and has been a leader in other parts of the industry, et cetera. And I have a leadership role in our company, and many others like me do. What is it that we can and should be doing to push the ball forward? Because you would hate, this can't be on the folks who have been on the receiving end of this for generations to go and fix. It's everyone's responsibility. What are the things that we in positions of privilege can and should be doing?
Well, of course, the first thing is becoming allies, becoming an ally, becoming a leader with a voice for this time and this movement, and understanding how to actually interweave that voice with the business, because people do appreciate that. But also, a lot of our leaders, and I think you know this, Eric, have had conversation. They have connected with Black associates. They have had meetings with groups of Black associates and white associates. I actually addressed a division that is all white, and they said they knew that this is not good and we need to have some conversation. And we did. It was an open, frank conversation. And, you know, I don't believe that people have ill intent, really. There are some bad eggs, but for the most part, people do not. I don't think they get up saying, I'm going to hate that person because of their color. I just don't believe that that is real. So it is about you becoming more involved, becoming an ally. There was a person who sent me a note saying she was going to become a mentor, leading the charge for what is right and decent in an organization. People will respect that and they will step up because they follow their leaders.
Yeah, that's great. And following on that, you sort of hit on it earlier with the program that you're just launching at Nielsen, but this topic of microaggressions, this seems to be another thing that's sort of in the area of the privileged or those of us who don't live with it. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what are microaggressions, why are they important to understand, and how can we deal with them going forward?
So, yeah, so microaggressions these are subtle acts. They're sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. They're behaviors, they're statements that people make as they communicate to someone that either they're going to be hostile, they're going to be derogatory, that kind of thing, negative messaging, and also may not be the intent, but it becomes the impact. So example, wow, you're very articulate. Well, you know what? I don't need you to tell me that. I do speak English and I choose how to use English when different venues. That's an insult. That is an insult. You don't need to tell someone that. How did you get here? And that's how did I get here? I was hired. Did you get that position because? And people really do. People are sometimes a little ballsy, and so they ask that kind of question. Like, no, I'm not affirmative action. If that's what you're trying to say. My son went to a private school, and there are some who are on scholarship, some who are not. And then they say, "Are you one of those? One of those what?" So those are subtle things. I don't see color. Please don't say that, because that says that my color doesn't matter. That's not what you want someone to say to you. And I would say that across the board, whether I was Black, Mexican, what, don't say that. There are the microaggressions that occur that are physical when someone is going into an elevator and they see, most of the time, if they see a Black man, it's definitely they're not getting in. These things are what cause people to feel, why? My husband would go to the track and he would come back and he said, I literally can clear the track. I can clear the track. If there are people there, white people there, I can clear the track. Because I guess they think he's going to rob them. He doesn't need their money. You see, you're making assumptions about people that are wrong. And we need to stop that. It's not good behavior.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that, and even when you say things like I don't see color, it may be well intentioned, but it's actually having the opposite effect. And I think the first step is for those of us who say and do those things, to have it pointed out that we're saying and doing them, and that we shouldn't, because it makes other people uncomfortable. And then, to your point about business outcomes, you don't get the best business outcomes because you don't retain the best people. And then to be able to do something about it when you see this type of behavior happening. So I think that's a really powerful concept and something that people should really be thinking about. And from one of the things I'm drawing from your talk, just want to get to one. We're just about out of time. I want to get to one question from the audience, if we could, which was, would you recommend surveying board members, executive management, employees, and customers to gather demographic data? Should it be anonymous? How can we reflect on those findings and take action? Do you have a sample survey you can provide? But maybe not so much that last piece, but how to collect that demographic data that you mentioned earlier to be able to start making the decisions you need to make.
Well, I made an assumption. So here's my assumption is that when in any organization you have the EEOC that gives you the demographics of who's in your organization. So you should be able to tell from that who's there. But of course, depending on your size of your organization, sometimes there's just the optics. You can just see it. But for the most part, it's the EEOC that you can pull the information, because most companies do report on that.
Okay.
And you are allowed to ask when people apply for jobs. You're allowed to ask. Now, of course, in other countries, you are not, but in the US, you can.
Okay. I think we are just about out of time here. So let's wrap up the segment. Sandra, thank you so much for sharing with us and giving the group a lot to talk about. I think I'm handing it back over to Claire. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Sandra Sims Williams and Eric Solomon. That was a great intro. It's so much deeper. There's so much to learn and to hear. So really appreciate the session that you've provided to us. Much appreciated. What a great way to kick off the forum. And now we're going to switch. So bye. You can uncamera. Okay. So it's now my honor to introduce Laura Gitman, who is Chief Operating Officer of the Business for Social Responsibility, better known as BSR. She's a global expert on corporate sustainability with decades of experience in advising leaders across many industry sectors. We're delighted to have Laura with us today to share her insights about corporate responsibility trends. And with that, Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and I'm really excited to be with you all today. It's a wonderful upside of the fact that we need to be virtual is that we have a much wider audience, and so it's fantastic to see so many participants, and thank you again for the opportunity to be with you. I wanted to talk a little bit about sustainable business in the age of COVID. And so I think, even kicking off with the session we just had, you can tell that the conversations that we're having, the issues that companies are working on are quite different than they were just a year ago. And so in many ways, everything has changed, and yet nothing has changed in terms of the same issues that we are going to be talking about are that much more relevant. They're that much more impactful to the business, and they're that much more urgent. And so the context surrounding all of that has changed. And I want to talk a little bit about how we see that playing out. Next slide, please. So the way at BSR we've been talking about our current moment really is in these two different components. There is the need to really meet the moment right now to respond to the urgent issues that are arising both from COVID-19 itself, from the pandemic, but as well as from the broader economic repercussions and from the rise in racial and social justice issues that we are experiencing here in America. And so there's a need to meet the current moment, and yet at the same time, not just look to go back to how things were and pretend that as long as we can pass the moment, everything will be okay. And so it really is, how do we leverage that moment to rebuild in a way that is going to enable our economy to work in a more fair and more sustainable manner? And so really important to be able to keep both of these in mind at any one point in time. We're seeing lots of businesses step up to the immediate challenge. So whether it's being really innovative around their manufacturing, how they're aiding certain populations, how they're really helping within their local communities, but really starting the calls to build back better and to collaborate and make commitments that may not have a direct impact on your business in 2020, but certainly are going to set the foundation for business to be effective and for your business to be successful as we move towards 2030. Next slide, please. So what are we seeing during the pandemic? And I think I get asked this question a lot. I think in the early days, there was a bit of a concern that sustainability or corporate responsibility was going to fall off, that companies were going to get into an urgent crisis mode and therefore not pay attention to some of their commitments on sustainability, or that these issues weren't going to get as much attention either internally or externally. And what we can tell you so far is that it has been the exact opposite. So sustainability has remained incredibly powerful. We've seen investor interest only continue to grow over the past couple months. And in many cases, the way that companies that perform well on ESG have performed financially, given market volatility, has emphasized why investors are so interested. So that is certainly not going anywhere. While at the same time, we are seeing that it is changing. And it's changing really in a couple ways. One is that the S of ESG is more important than ever. And in many ways, I think there was always a desire for the S to be, equal and to be on par with the environmental and governance issues, but it was often seen as a bit squishier, a bit harder to measure, harder to articulate what the particular commitments are. And I think what the pandemic and the racial justice issues have really highlighted is how incredibly connected the social aspects, whether it's the your direct labor, the health and justice in your community, how those really do impact your business. And so we're seeing a real focus on traditionally disadvantaged communities. We're seeing tax practices and executive compensation practices come under even greater scrutiny, especially as you're seeing bailouts or subsidies. We're seeing really fascinating new technologies that are developed to meet health needs, to keep our employees safe, but that are going to raise a whole host of new social questions around human rights and privacy implications. We're seeing supply chains under incredible pressure, and that means that the dislocation of workers and the need to be able to ensure resilience of your supply chain, not just the efficiency of your supply chain, are starting to get more attention. So that S is really something that that is evolving. And then more broadly is that a recognition that sustainability efforts really do need to evolve and need to be even closer tied to core strategy. So in order to have a more resilient business strategy, and I'll talk more about this, in order to focus on long-term value creation, in order to integrate into how you think about risk, how you think about your future ability to drive strategy through really unforeseen circumstances. Sustainable business practices are getting more attention at the board. They're getting more attention by enterprise risk functions, by strategy functions, and that's a really good thing that has been in many ways accelerated by the current crisis. Next slide, please. So if I were to really articulate how teams, and many of you who are participating today probably sit in a function that has corporate responsibility or sustainability as at least a part of your function, there's really 5 ways that we're seeing companies adapt to meet the moment. One is really thinking about the connection to innovation and how can they use sustainability to identify unmet needs that can really be translated into direct core business opportunities. The second is to facilitate change through coalitions and connections. So to recognize that you're not going to solve all of these issues on your own as a company. And often it's the sustainability team that is able to really drive that kind of new and collaborative approach. To promote values-based decisions. So this is a time when corporate values are really being tested. And when you don't have the time to do a whole bunch of analysis and focus groups to road test what your statements are going to be, I think the previous speaker really drew attention to the need to be able to make values-based decisions and to integrate that into how you work as a business. And secondly, to bring diverse voices and perspectives to those decisions. And then lastly is, this idea about a license to operate, which in many ways is where the field began a few decades ago. And we've come full circle that business by itself doesn't necessarily have a license to operate unless they can show and really demonstrate how they are taking care of their employees, their customers, the communities in which they operate, their supply chains, and the broader value chain, and to not take that license to operate for granted. Next slide. So I talked before about resilient business strategy, and I've actually been talking about, and BSR has been working on resilient business strategy for a number of years, and I would highlight a report we published, I think, 2 years ago called Redefining Sustainable Business. But what I think the past couple months have really shown us is that the need to build a resilient business strategy is more important than ever. And there's a couple of really important ways in which sustainability enables more resilient strategies. So what do I mean by resilient strategies? I mean one that is able to address uncertainty. I think if you would have asked any of us 6 or 7 months ago where we would be right now, I think very few of us would have said everybody in the US would be working from home except for essential workers, and that we would be in the state that we are. And yet pandemics have been on, the top list of likely events in most scenario planning for decades. It was predictable, as can a lot of elements of uncertainty. What futures thinking and scenario planning enables you to do is not to predict, okay, this is going to happen and when, but it's to be able to say, if this happens, is our strategy going to be able to survive that stress? Have we thought about the kinds of decisions we might need to make to enable our business to be stronger so that we're not overly dependent on one particular supplier or one particular ingredient, that we've thought through how to structure our organization in a way that enables us to be more resilient overall? And so futures thinking and scenario planning helps with that. ERM, enterprise risk management, and integration of materiality helps with that. And then just making sure that you've got the right voices around the table for decisions, because you're not going to be able to predict and define exactly what your strategy is going to be able to be, but that you've got the right voices at the table and a diverse enough set of perspectives that you'll be able to be flexible and resilient as things arise. Next slide, please. I think I'll skip this because I won't be able to do it justice, but just want to point out that certainly diversity and inclusion efforts, as we just heard so brilliantly, are really being seen now as a critical component of corporate responsibility and of sustainability efforts, whereas sometimes those fields were seen as a bit more disparate. And that is true across investors, consumers, your employees, as well as what we're seeing companies really getting out there and do. So there's a lot to come on this issue, and I certainly loved the focus on DE&I with a real focus on equity. Next slide, please. So at BSR, what we would recommend, that I think is very much aligned with what Sandra went over, is that we need to really recognize that that the system itself has failed, and so company activities can't just be around those companies. They really do need to be both about what you're doing for your firm as well as your role in the larger system. So to get there, companies really need to be proactive, and that means embracing transparent approaches to data, building that diverse leadership and a diverse management pipeline, as Sandra talked about, but also really shifting away from vague platitudes to something that is much more specific, that is really tailored to what the company is doing, and that also talks about intersectionality. And I think this is a really interesting point that has come up, right? So we can't talk about the impact of the pandemic without talking about the impact on populations that were already being marginalized by our system. And so we're looking at the intersection of how all of these issues really play out, right? So who is most impacted by climate? It's often women. It's often people in certain parts of the most vulnerable populations in countries around the world. And so both acknowledging those situations and being balanced around what you can do as a company and what you're looking to achieve. Next slide, please. So as part of this, what BSR recently published, and there's a link to this report here that I think many of you will find interesting, is really looking at and questioning business's role overall in creating what we would call a 21st century social contract. And so recognizing that the social contract, the contract between citizens and your government and business and government, has been broken and has been broken for quite a long time. And it's not just about government fixing that. Yes, voting is important and good policy is important, but there's a really powerful role that business can play that thinks about stakeholder capitalism rather than just shareholder capitalism, that focuses on skill development and career pathways that really enable a workforce to thrive in our new economy, which is very different than what the old economy looked like. To think about economic security and mobility, a just transition as we address climate change issues, make sure that we're creating high quality jobs and that we're supporting workers and communities that are affected by the transition, and that we're thinking about the implications for worker data protection as we are implementing new technologies. So there's a lot of real good detail underneath each of these that are in the report. But I think most important is for you to walk away with a recognition that there is a role for business to play in this effort. Next slide, please. Great. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Claire. Hopefully that gave you just a little bit of a taste of some of the trends of what we're seeing, and we'll now get into more of a dialogue.
We're now ready to hear from our final speaker, Jessica Woolmuth of EY or Ernst & Young. Jessica is principal of EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Services practice. Jessica, hi. Jessica leads cross-functional and cross-cultural teams on environment, health, and safety and sustainability engagements with many industries. And we're delighted to have her here today to talk about the latest in workplace safety during these pandemic times. Certainly something we're all thinking about a lot these days. So over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, I'm sure we would love to just be done with all of this and not thinking about it at all. But unfortunately, I think we're going to be dealing with this for quite a while. And for folks focused on corporate responsibility and sustainability, environmental health and safety has always been a table stakes issue. And really, having a strong program for your manufacturing and your industrial workers has been, super important, as well as in your supply chain. But now with the COVID pandemic, that program needs to really expand beyond just industrial manufacturing workers to your entire workforce as we contemplate returning back to that physical workplace. So what I hope to cover in a few minutes here is really three things. One, talk about EY's perspective on what we call physical return and work reimagined, and meshes nicely with some of the comments that Laura said. I'm going to talk about how kind of standard fundamental principles around health and safety management systems can really help us as we look to maintain these COVID management programs. And then talk a bit about how this all ties back into a theme that's, I think, resonated with all the speakers today around corporate responsibility and long-term value. So with that, the next slide, please. We're an accounting firm at Ernst & Young, so I have to make sure you know that none of this is tax advice or other professional advice. So disclaimer for you all there. But next slide. So here, this slide really talks about our EY perspective on this return to work and work reimagined. And, Laura, it matches nicely with your framework around, I think I wrote it down, you talked about meeting the moment and building the future. So it's really that idea that what's hard and difficult for organizations right now is that we have this gear one that's a very tactically focused gear around creating a trusted transition and keeping people safe. So this is all the tactical things that we need to do through the pandemic, both as people are working from home, but then also ensuring for our essential workforce and folks returning that it's a safe return, and really creating another theme I've heard is having a people first perspective or employee first kind of perspective. Gear two is really the more fun gear, this transformative gear, where we think about, what does this mean? What does this mean as we come out of COVID, and how is business going to be fundamentally transformed. But also, what does this mean that we can do with this time, that we have time to rethink how workplaces function, and what this means for our business. I think from a corporate responsibility perspective, some things I think about here is, what are the carbon benefits that we're seeing, and how can we extend that beyond, or what are we learning around employee engagement in this remote environment that we can leverage in the future? The idea being that organizations that really take this time and learn to transform will really outperform in the end. Okay, next slide. So this is really a little more detail on Gear 1 and Gear 2. So Gear 1, that tactical transition, is all around developing plans, taking actions and implementing those plans, and then making sure those plans work, or the check part of that. I think the thing, as we're learning, as it's been several months now, is that many people have these good, strong plans, but what's difficult is being able to sustain them over time. So that's one thing. And the second is how important it is to be very agile in the development and implementation of these plans. So, I think many of you are probably in New York or near New York. And in New York, for example, the caseload has gotten very low, and that's really great, a testament to all the hard work that people in New York have been doing to control the pandemic. But things like mass transit, things like elevators, supporting services have really slowed down return to work, when many of the clients that we talk to are considering maybe not even returning until the first of the year, or definitely not anytime soon. In more suburban places, I think there's been a quicker return to work, but a need to, in some cases, to respond to increasing case counts, and needing to be able to backscale or backstep those plans. And so really being agile as we think through all the tactical transition things that need to be done throughout return to work is really important. Gear 2, I talked about this, is the transformation, or the fun part of thinking through what's the opportunities, or what can we possibly take advantage of through this hard time that we're all experiencing. And I think I mentioned some of these before, but I think we can really think about, and we've heard this on previous calls, what are consumers' expectations or customers' expectations going to change around health and wellness, around really expanding the trust agenda. And then how can we use this technology that we've gotten so good at? I think it's been a surprise across the board as I talk to organizations around their return to work plans. It's been a surprise how well the technology has been working, and how good we're all getting at using this technology and being on video, for example, and not in person in New York. It's amazing. So how can we use this to really leverage for greater things long term? Okay, next slide. So this slide has a lot of detail in it. It's really intended to just give you a kind of a sense of think of it as all of the chapters that would be important to have in a return to work, or return to physical work, I should say, playbook. I tend to focus on the environmental health and safety component. So those are the things on the left, such as being cognizant of all the changing government and policy requirements that, again, require some agility, because there's so much changing at the federal level, state level, local level, really something that needs to be, you need to keep abreast of all the time. Then there are all the, programmatic things to consider around health and safety. And I'll talk about those in some more detail. But for me, for someone that's in environmental health and safety and sustainability, it's easy to forget about all the technology components, the business continuity components, and the financial stability components that are really important around managing through this pandemic. The other thing I wanted to mention on this slide is, many folks, I think many organizations have already built their plans, and have done a great job of building playbooks and communicating kind of the policies that they are already or will be using to keep workers safe and keep their organization safe and customers safe through the pandemic. Where I think people are struggling, or what I hear, I hear through clients that we talk to is this kind of operationalizing of that. So just to tell you a story, I think I talked to somebody that's in healthcare, and she said, oh, we've had this great plan around taking temperatures and monitoring symptoms and changing our sick policies. But you know what, that lasted about a week, and now we're back to kind of rushing around and not really implementing and taking advantage of all those policies. And so that's, you know, I'll talk a bit more about how we can support that and how we can really focus on operationalize that operational component. And then there's also the communication component. So that's, you know, understanding and listening to our staff and understanding that this is really an anxious time, and that so it's important to both hear that and phase your plans, maybe scale them up or down, your return to work plans based on what you're hearing, and then be able to communicate effectively all the things that you're doing to protect your workforce. So in terms of that listening, I'll just share a tidbit from EY. We do regular kind of listening surveys for our staff. And what we've been finding is that while folks were fairly eager to return to work, that's probably an overstatement, that folks were you know, somewhat eager to return to work, that over time that has gotten, people have gotten more concerned about returning to work, so that there's been that kind of fear of returning has increased over time. And so that's really caused us to kind of slow our return to work plans in different geographies. Okay, next slide. So here, this is what I get passionate about, because I think that it is so hard to kind of maintain and sustain strong health and safety management programs. What's really helpful is to think about what we've learned in a more of an industrial setting around health and safety, of using a management system approach. And so this is based on the Deming cycle, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And over on the right, you can kind of see some of the important pieces of that, or what that means in the context of COVID. So a plan, developing the plan, of course, is the first part. And that's, I think that's, in some ways, it doesn't feel like it, but that's the easy part, right? You figure out, well, how are we going to fix all these problems? You think through it and then develop that plan. The do is where many of us are just starting as return to work is beginning. And so that's implementing that plan. But the important part that people forget about is the check and the act. And so that's really taking the time to have processes in place to make sure that those policies, whether it's temperature checking or regular cleaning, are being implemented. And then making sure that you take the information that you learn from that check activity and help make improvements or continuous improvement into your plans. Okay, next slide. So this gets a little bit detailed, but I thought some of you might be in the middle of helping support these plans. So I wanted to talk about what we're learning as people return to work. So first one I mentioned already is around this phased approach, that be ready to back off on your plan. Heard of many organizations that started back to work and realized that they really need to back down again. So don't be scared of that. Under governance, one I'll point out is around sick policies. So it's important to think about, you know, many of you might be already doing this, but taking that self-assessment questionnaire around, you know, are you having any symptoms? Are you ready for work? But unless you actually change your sick policies that allow people to feel comfortable that they could stay home, you're likely going to have a lot of non-conformance with that policy. Third, you know, think about from a social distancing perspective. I think hard about visitors and vendors. If you have the luxury to do that, we see many organizations really limiting visitors and vendors. And because we've gotten so good at all this video conferencing and all this technology, that you really can think, you know, can work through limiting those visitors and vendors. From a health surveillance standpoint, I'll just point out that we're really seeing a lot of advancement in technology. So if you haven't considered it yet, consider some technology to help with health surveillance, contact tracing. Amazing amount of innovation going on there. A couple more quick things around PPE. You know, we hear so much about face coverings and masks. And I think an interesting thing that some of the research is showing is, originally we thought of N95 masks. That's what a lot of healthcare workers wear. that's intended to protect a worker from the virus, from an airborne virus, because it has a filter in there. Where face covering is really intended to protect others from your, aerosols that might be, coming from you if you're infected. But what they're learning is that the face coverings are actually also protective of people wearing them as well. And I think it's a lot to do with that you're not touching your mouth as much, and that it does provide some barrier from aerosols. So just a more reinforcement about how valuable face coverings are. And last thing I'll touch on is around engineered controls. While cleaning and sanitation, of course, we're all learning how to wash our hands well. Well, that's very important. More and more what they're learning is the importance of looking at your HVAC system and making sure that the indoor air ratio is as high as it can be, as well as having a HEPA filter or other filters. That's really a big component about how the virus is transmitted. And so last but not least, so we can allow some time for questions, I just want to go to the next slide and really try to tie this all together. So, Sandra talked about this, Laura and Devin both talked about this, but as CSR, or corporate responsibility or sustainability folks, what's interesting and great about all these issues is how much strong management of them ties to long-term value. And what I'd leave you with is that the importance of health and safety, the importance of strong COVID management will have on your long-term value, really in engagement with your workforce, in how you communicate with customers and your consumers about the safety of your product. And it ties all into the overall trust agenda that we know has gotten so much more important with investors and with customers and employees. Okay, with that, I've been getting some questions from the audience. So I'll take a look at some of those. Okay, one question was around telework, and are more companies finding that, let's see, more companies considering a more permanent acceptance of telework as opposed, to reduce exposure during the pandemic, but also from a greenhouse gas perspective. And I would say definitely, we have kind of been on a road show for a long time around last several months around return to work and having many conversations with clients, and are hearing, I would say across the board that companies are considering more flexible policies, even like, long-term kind of clients that really had a kind of like, you need to be a culture where you really needed to be present. We're finding that folks are changing their policies to be more flexible, and not so much that people won't return, but that this has clearly worked, and so that there's going to be more flexibility to allow for that. So I would say yes, definitely a permanent acceptance of telework. The second part of the question had to do with it because of a carbon footprint perspective, and I would say I've seen less of that, though I think because of that ability to, that people have seen this work in practice, that certainly can be part of the conversation, that's reducing Scope 3 emissions is a really great benefit of some of this telework. Okay, I'm going to check if there's more questions. A question around how can businesses deal with customer fears around health and safety in business locations? Great question. And there's a couple of things. I have an engineering background, so I love to just think it's all about the engineering and getting the controls right. And we could talk about hierarchy of controls and how important that is. But I think from a customer and consumer perspective, it really is a lot has to do with not only what you're doing, but how you're communicating and showing that. And so, I think strong signage, strong, what's the right word? Demonstration by your employees of following things like face coverings are really helpful. I also think anytime you can have what's called an engineered control, or something that is permanent, like you might see in the grocery stores, those plastic shields. I think things like that really both are effective, but then also kind of communicate that you're, or are tangible things that consumers can see that you're being protective. And let's see if we get another one. Okay, another question, and maybe probably the last one we have time for is, the news media is full of conflicting information about what works and what's needed now regarding COVID-19 and workplace safety, and how can businesses effectively ensure compliance with it when this is going on? Yeah, great question. You know, like anything, like everything really in corporate responsibility, we like to always go back to the science. And so, you know, what's tricky is how much we're learning. I just heard a podcast around, you know, doctors trying to explain why things are changing, and there's certainly political reasons why information is changing, but it's also that the science is changing. And so I think my advice really is just to be very, to pick some sources that you feel like you really trust, and then be very principled about keeping up on those. And just like I mentioned in that plan, do, check, act cycle, being willing to stay agile and change your plans in order to keep up with that changing information, that new information that we're learning. And with that, I think we're getting close to time to wrap up. So Claire, I think it's back over to you.
Thank you. That was great, Jessica. So much information that's been reinforced from a lot of the things that we've been hearing. So thank you so much. Very valuable information that I hope all of you can use. Just a footnote for those of you who are in New York, on the governor's website, you know, there are templates, and I don't know about other states, but there are templates for these safety plans if you don't know, if you haven't started yet. So that's a place to look. So thank you, Jessica. I want to thank all of our remarkable speakers today. This has been pretty fast paced. It's gone so quickly. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I also want to thank Luana Lewis, our SVP of programs, together with her team and the program committee, who have done a magnificent job of organizing this session. And again, I want to thank all of our BBB colleagues for helping to promote this program. So many of you have attended. And with that, I also want to thank, again, our sponsors, Ernst & Young as our major sponsor, Nielsen, as well as all of our event supporters who collaborated with us on the event. We invite you to visit the Better Business Bureau's website at bbb.org anytime to find information about businesses and charities that you can trust. With this, our program, believe it or not, is concluding. We'll be back again in 2021. Watch for a save the date, whether it's online or whether it's in person, to be determined. But I want to thank you all for your attention today and for helping to make this such a great event. And with that, the program is concluded. Thank you once again.